I still smell the bread, even now, decades later, when I walk past a bakery and that warm yeast smell reaches me through the open door. My heart does something complicated that I cannot fully describe to anyone who was not there. It is not quite fear anymore. It is the memory of fear, which is a different thing entirely. Softer at the edges, but somehow more permanent. The smell of fresh bread should mean comfort and warmth and ordinary life. For me, it will always mean a dead man's pistol, wrapped in linen and buried beneath a golden loaf, and the sound of my own breathing in a checkpoint line, and the particular quality of silence that exists in the 3 seconds before a German soldier decides whether to search your basket or wave you through. My name is Sister Franziska Idelda, and for 2 years and 4 months during the German occupation of Belgium, I smuggled weapons inside bread baskets through 7 military checkpoints for the resistance army. I am telling you this now because I am the last person alive who knows the full truth of what happened, and the bread should finally mean something more than survival. I want to start with who I was before the occupation, because I think it matters deeply. The distance between who you are before the world breaks and who you become inside the breaking. I entered the convent of Our Lady of Perpetual Sorrow in Liège in 1934 at the age of 22. I was the youngest of 5 daughters from a flour miller's family in the countryside outside the city, which meant two things that became quietly essential to everything that followed. First, I had grown up surrounded by the smell and substance and production of bread, in the way that other children grow up surrounded by music or language. It was simply the texture of my earliest world. Second, my father's mill supplied flour to half the bakeries in the surrounding region, which meant I had grown up knowing bakers, knowing their schedules, knowing the rhythm of their deliveries and their relationships and their routes. I did not know when I took my vows in 1934 that this particular childhood would one day determine whether 200 resistance fighters lived or died. God's preparation is very patient and very specific. The convent ran a bakery. This is the fact around which everything else eventually organized itself. We baked bread for distribution to the poor families of Liège, a practice the convent had maintained for over a century, long before I arrived and long before the Germans came. When the occupation began in May of 1940, and the city changed overnight from a place of ordinary life into a place of systematic fear, the bakery continued because the Germans permitted charitable operations that kept the civilian population from complete desperation, which in turn kept civilian unrest at manageable levels. They were practical about this. They allowed us to bake and to distribute because a starving civilian population was more trouble than a fed one, and because nuns delivering bread to poor neighborhoods was so thoroughly unthreatening an image that it essentially functioned as its own disguise. I did not seek out the resistance. I want to be honest about this because the story told afterward always implies a clarity of intention that the actual experience did not contain. The resistance found me. Specifically, a man named Peter found me in the spring of 1941, on a Tuesday morning when he arrived at the convent's back delivery entrance, claiming to be a supplier delivering additional flour. He was not a flour supplier. He was a 34-year-old former schoolteacher from Namur who had been running a weapons distribution network for the Belgian resistance for 8 months, and who had recently lost his primary courier to a Gestapo arrest that had come too close to unraveling the entire operation. Peter knew about the convent bakery. He knew about our distribution routes. He knew that Sister Franziska, the nun who managed the bread deliveries, traveled on foot and by bicycle through 6 different neighborhoods twice weekly, carrying large wicker baskets, and that the German checkpoints on those routes had become so accustomed to the sight of this particular small nun with her bread baskets that they rarely performed thorough searches anymore. He had watched the routes for 3 weeks before he came to me. He had timed the checkpoints. He had noted the shift changes and which soldiers were meticulous and which were indifferent. He had done, in other words, everything except ask the nun herself, which was the one variable he could not observe from a distance. He told me what he needed in very plain language, sitting in our convent's small receiving room while I held a cup of tea that I never drank. He needed someone to carry weapons, primarily pistols and ammunition, occasionally detonators, through the checkpoints, and deliver them to specific addresses in specific neighborhoods at specific times. He told me the weapons would go to resistance fighters who were conducting operations against the occupation. He told me that if I were caught, the Germans would not treat my habit as protection. He told me that two previous couriers had been arrested, one of whom had been shot, and one of whom was in a German prison whose conditions he described with quiet precision, because he believed I deserved to know exactly what I was agreeing to. And then he waited. He was very good at waiting, Peter. He did not press me or persuade me or appeal to my patriotism or my faith. He simply put the full truth on the table and waited to see what I would do with it. I thought about the families I delivered bread to twice a week. I thought about the children I saw in those neighborhoods, growing up under occupation, learning fear as their first adult lesson. I thought about a Jewish family on the Rue des Augustines, whose name I knew from our distribution list, and who had disappeared 3 weeks earlier without explanation, without goodbye, without trace. I thought about what Peter was describing: men and women in the dark conducting operations against the machine producing these disappearances. And I thought about what it meant to deliver bread to hungry people while other people died trying to ensure the hungry people would eventually live in freedom. I told him I needed one night to pray and that he should return in the morning. He returned in the morning, and I said yes. The first delivery nearly destroyed me. Not because anything went wrong, but because everything went exactly right, which was in some ways more terrifying than difficulty would have been. Peter had prepared a false bottom in one of my oldest and largest bread baskets, a deep wicker basket I had used for years on the northern route delivery, constructed with enough space beneath a fitted wooden panel to conceal two wrapped pistols and a quantity of ammunition. The bread sat above, as it always sat, genuine loaves baked that morning, still warm, still fragrant. The panel was precise enough that it would not shift or rattle if the basket was jostled, which Peter had tested himself before handing it to me. I walked the northern route on a Wednesday morning in June of 1941, with that basket over my arm and something happening inside my chest that I can only describe as the complete and simultaneous presence of every emotion a human body is capable of producing. I was terrified. I was resolute. I was nauseated. I was, underneath all of it, profoundly awake, in the way I had only previously felt during the deepest moments of contemplative prayer, when the world sharpens to a single point of absolute presence. The checkpoint at the Rue de la Régence was staffed that morning by a soldier I recognized from months of the same route, a heavy-faced man in his 40s who always waved me through with the same minimal gesture, a slight lift of his chin that meant pass and contained no curiosity whatsoever. He waved me through with the same lift of his chin. 2 pistols and a box of ammunition traveled beneath my bread past a German military checkpoint and arrived at an address on the Rue Hors Chateau 40 minutes later, where a man I had never met and would never see again opened the door 6 centimeters, took the basket, handed it back empty except for the genuine bread, which he had removed and restacked, and closed the door without a word exchanged between us. I stood on the street for a moment in the June morning sun, and I breathed, and I kept walking, because standing still was not something a delivery nun did. Over the following months, the operation grew in ways I had not anticipated. Peter's network had been cautious with me initially, testing routes and quantities and timing. When it became clear that my routes were genuinely reliable, that the checkpoints on my regular paths had developed the institutional blindness that comes from months of routine, the requests increased. Additional baskets were modified. The range of materials expanded. I carried pistols and ammunition throughout 1941. By early 1942, I was occasionally carrying components for explosive devices, wrapped with extraordinary care by men whose expertise in such things I chose not to examine too closely, because understanding exactly what I was carrying would have made it impossible to carry it calmly, and calm was the only thing protecting both of us. There were 7 checkpoints across my regular routes, 7 different gauntlets, each with different soldiers, different levels of thoroughness, different hours of shift change that Peter's network tracked with obsessive precision. I learned each one the way a musician learns a difficult passage, technically at first, and then bodily, until the right face and the right pace and the right degree of unhurried holiness became automatic. I learned that Tuesday mornings were safer than Friday afternoons because Friday afternoon soldiers were tired and irritable and more likely to perform thorough searches out of boredom or frustration. I learned that a basket of bread that smelled powerfully of fresh baking created a sensory distraction that was worth more than any technical concealment. I learned that direct and gentle eye contact with checkpoint soldiers was safer than avoidance, that avoidance read as guilt, and directness read as innocence, and that a small, genuine smile from a middle aged nun carrying bread disarmed men in ways that no disguise could replicate. The closest moment came in March of 1943. I have replayed it so many times across the years that I sometimes worry the memory has been polished smooth by repetition, but I believe the essential facts remain accurate. A new commanding officer had been assigned to the Gestapo unit operating in our district, a young man known for his methodical thoroughness, and he had instituted a period of intensified checkpoint searches across the entire city. Peter had warned me. He had offered to suspend operations for 2 weeks until the intensity relaxed. I had declined because the resistance unit waiting for the delivery could not wait 2 weeks, and Peter's network had no other route available at that moment. The soldier who stopped me that morning was someone I had never seen before, young and sharp-eyed, and possessed of the particular dangerous quality of someone who had not yet learned to perform his job on automatic. He asked me to set the basket on the inspection table. He removed the bread loaves one by one, setting each aside with methodical care. He ran his hands along the inside of the basket. His fingers reached the false bottom and pressed. I watched his face, and I prayed with a focus and intensity that I believe was the most concentrated prayer of my entire religious life. Not a prayer in words, but a prayer that was simply the total direction of everything I was toward a single desperate point of need. The panel held. His fingers pressed and found it solid and moved on. He replaced the bread, handed me the basket, and stepped aside. I thanked him in French. He did not respond. I walked through the checkpoint, and I did not alter my pace by a single step, because altering your pace on the far side of a checkpoint is the thing that makes soldiers turn around and look again. I maintained exactly the pace of an ordinary delivery nun on an ordinary Wednesday morning until I turned the corner and the checkpoint was behind me. And then I stopped walking, and I leaned against the wall of a building, and I pressed my hand flat against the stone because I needed to feel something solid and real and permanent while everything inside me shook. I delivered to 47 different addresses across 2 years and 4 months. Peter told me once, near the end of the occupation, when we could finally speak more freely, that the weapons I had carried had been used in 11 specific resistance operations. He did not tell me the details of those operations, and I did not ask, because there are boundaries to what a woman needs to know about the consequences of her choices, and I had already made my peace with consequence in the abstract, which was the only way I had found to keep walking through checkpoints. I knew that what I carried was being used against the occupation. I knew that the occupation was killing people with efficiency and system. I knew that the resistance was trying to interrupt that efficiency. The specific details lived in a space I deliberately did not enter. When the liberation came in September of 1944, and the German soldiers left Liège, and the city came outside into the streets and wept with a collective relief that felt almost impossible for the body to contain, I carried my bread baskets through those streets, as I had always carried them, because the poor families on my routes still needed bread, and because bread was, in the end, what I had always been. The weapons were someone else's work. The bread was mine. I had simply allowed, for 2 years and 4 months, for those two things to travel together through the broken world and toward something better. Peter survived the war. We met once afterward in 1947 at a small gathering of former resistance members that I attended in civilian clothes because I was not sure my presence as a nun would be comfortable for everyone there. He shook my hand and said that I had been the best courier in his network and that I should know that. I told him that the bread had been very good that year and that it had seemed a shame to waste the routes. He laughed. It was the first time I had heard him laugh in all the years I had known him, and it was a good laugh, full and genuine, and belonging to a man who had survived something and was still, improbably, grateful to be standing in the world. I am grateful too. I bake bread still, here in this small convent kitchen where I have lived since 1952. I bake it every Tuesday and Wednesday morning, as I always have, and I distribute it to whoever needs it, as I always have. The baskets have no false bottoms anymore. They contain only what they appear to contain. And sometimes when I lift one and feel its familiar weight and smell the warm yeast rising in the morning air, I think about all the things that ordinary objects can carry when the world requires them to carry more than they were made for. I think about what I was made for and what the occupation required of me. And I find, at 80 years old, that I have no argument with either. God made me a baker's daughter and put me in a convent with a bakery and gave me routes through a city that needed more than bread. I simply followed where all of it led.